We were born in 1968 to provide research support to the Foreign Affairs Committee of Parliament, making us Canada's oldest organization dedicated to strengthening inclusive democracy at home and worldwide. Our relationship with Parliament has been central for over half a century, and the Parliament of Canada generously hosts us in their precinct. We provided orientation and research support to legislators and committees and engaged parliamentarians and staff as peers in our work to strengthen more than 120 democratic institutions in over 70 countries. Our patron is the Right Honourable David Johnston, former Governor General of Canada, and our board comprises of diverse individuals with careers in academia, politics, representing all major parties, foreign affairs, development, law, and public administration. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you here today to launch our new partnership with Carleton University, Engage Parle Diplo. It builds, as Maureen mentioned, on the success of the Carleton Initiative for Parliamentary and Diplomatic Engagement. We will deliver programming where decision makers and diplomats will learn more about Canada's democratic institutions and where they can dialogue about crucial issues affecting Canada's governance and Canada's global influence. Under this partnership, Carleton will support us with Carleton students who will work to design and deliver the Engage Parle Diplo events and undertake research to advance our new incubator for resilient and inclusive democracy. The incubator will leverage other research partnerships to explore contemporary challenges to democracy and strengthen our ability to develop more impactful programming at home and in developing democracies. Maureen will tell you about the corporate sponsors who are making Engage Parle Diplo possible, but I want to stress how proud we are to have a private sector in Canada that understands the value of democratic institutions and the need for Canada to play a leadership role in the world when it comes to standing up for universal rights and freedoms. Parliamentary Centre recently launched a new strategic plan, and you'll be hearing more about it in the coming days. The three main points that guide our strategy are: the first is democracy is under threat everywhere, and we need to work harder than ever to defend it and to support others working to achieve it. The second is that democratic development should be central to Canada's foreign and development policy. And the third is rooted in the belief that outcomes are better when women and men representing the diversity of societies are equal partners in inclusive democratic institutions. Our new strategy focuses on deepening collaboration with Parliament and its members, with diplomats who serve in our country, Global Affairs Canada, academics, and other development organizations. We look forward to working with members of the diplomatic community, our legislators, to ensure that Engage Parle Diplo helps us advance and achieve these critical goals. We invite you to follow us on social media and to learn more about our work in Canada and internationally. Thank you very much, and enjoy the discussion.
Thanks, Tom. As Tom mentioned, we have a range of important programming coming up, and it is made possible by our sponsors. I'd like to thank our sponsors, all leaders in their sectors, for their generous support of Engage Parle Diplo and their understanding of how corporate support allows us to stage meaningful dialogue with policymakers and design more effective programming to uphold our shared democratic values. Our sponsors are Air Canada, CN, IBC, Manulife, Nutrien, Suncor, TELUS, TD, and Toyota. Again, we thank you. And now it's time to start our election primer. We are very lucky to have with us one of Canada's most highly regarded pollsters. David Coletto is CEO of Abacus Data. He's been following this election closely. He has brand new polling data to share with us this morning and his insights. And David, I know that the audience will have questions. I would ask them to please use the Q&A function. And David, thank you for agreeing to stay on, to listen to our panel, and to join the question and answer session that will follow. David will answer questions then. David, your audience.
Well, thank you very much, Maureen, for the introduction. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I was reflecting on the fact that for those in the audience who were at our event back in 2019, it both feels like light years past, but also yesterday. And as I was seeing the data today, it almost feels like this election is a rehash in some ways of the previous election. And so I'm going to get right into the data. I've got about 20 minutes and way more data than I can fit into that period. But my goal here today is to really give you insights into, how the campaign has unfolded so far from the public's perspective, and then to hopefully give you some insight to where it might end more than a week from now. And obviously tonight we have the second French language leaders debate. Tomorrow is the English language leaders debate. And both of those, I think, could be important in helping Canadians figure out who they're going to support and ultimately impact the outcome of the election. But I want to start with what I think are the key takeaways. And as you're going to see, both from our polling and I think a lot of the other polling that's come out over the last few days, is that this race is very close. Our numbers, as you'll see, are tied, but on the range of surveys, and there's been lots of polling out over the last even few days, it shows that while the Conservatives might have a slight advantage in the popular vote, that the Liberals seemingly are doing well enough that the outcome is almost on a knife's edge in terms of who will have the most seats in Parliament. There's a whole other conversation to have about what government gets formed after that. But I think from the public's perspective, this is still very close, and there's increasing understanding that this race is close and that the outcome is uncertain. Now, there's two other factors that I think are important to understanding how this campaign has gone. The first being, when this election was called by the Prime Minister, I was on record of saying this is as good a time as ever to call the election. In hindsight, maybe not the best insight, but I think we all felt that when you looked at the metrics and how people were feeling in July and August, that the country was in a better mood. The opposition looked disorganized and divided, and the Prime Minister was well regarded in terms of his handling of the pandemic. In a very short period of time, that changed. And Mr. O'Toole, the Conservative leader, has done a very good job at what I think connecting with past Conservative voters, those that voted Conservative in 2019, but has still struggled to build support beyond that audience. And that is why any momentum that they had in the first 2 weeks of this campaign seems to be stalled, and they haven't been able to make much more gains beyond that. I'll show you the data that I think provides evidence of that. Ultimately, though, if we are going to see whatever the outcome might be, whether it be a Conservative minority, a Liberal minority, there's still, I think, a chance for a majority for the Liberals, although it's far less likely now than it was maybe a few months ago, that this election, as it often is the case in the past few decades, will be decided where more progressive center-left voters ultimately go. And we've seen some movement and improvement on the right side of the spectrum with the rise of the People's Party. There was a poll out this morning that suggested that support was up to 9% nationally. We're not seeing that in our polls, but there's indications that there's some energy and excitement for Max Bernier's party that's creating challenges for Mr. O'Toole. But on the left side of the spectrum, the New Democrats continue to be the barrier for the Liberals to win an outright majority and maybe even get reelected overall. So here's what I'm seeing right now. When we ask people how they would vote, we have a tie. And this survey was done from Friday until Monday morning. So relatively new numbers. It was done completely after the French language debate last Thursday. And so we've got the Conservatives and Liberals tied, the New Democrats in third at 21%, the Bloc at 7%, the People's Party at 3%, and the Green Party at 3%. When we look at the trend line going back to November of 2020, there's a few things to note. There was one moment in our tracking anyways, just earlier this week, where the Conservatives actually numerically got ahead of the Liberals. But you can see that from the beginning of the campaign to basically now, the Conservatives are up 4 points. The Liberals took a big dip once this election was called, but it stayed relatively stable in our numbers. And the New Democrats had picked up a little bit of momentum coming out of the summer and have sort of, come back down to still a high point for them in terms of the last number of years. They got 16% of the vote in the last election, so 21% would be a significant improvement, but they haven't been able to gain much traction either. Another important point is the decline of the Green Party. Back in 2019, when I was presenting to the same group, we talked a lot about how the Green Party had some momentum. They had formed the official opposition in Prince Edward Island. They had won a by-election. They're now polling at the very low single digits, 2 to 3%, and they're only running candidates in three-quarters of the ridings. So the party is very disorganized. It doesn't have a well-known leader. And although she's going to be in the debates tonight and tomorrow, the party is really struggling, which I think has benefited mainly the New Democrats, but also to some extent the People's Party and the Liberals, which sounds strange if you follow politics in Canada closely, but it's the nature of the Green coalition that sometimes isn't linear and disperses in different ways. Now, obviously in Canada, because we're so regionalized, the story is really below the national numbers. In British Columbia and the West Coast, we're seeing a very close three-way race. The sample sizes in some of these provinces are smaller, so don't get fixated on the exact number, but look at the general state of the race. In the prairies in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, the Conservatives continue to do very well. They're still polling below their numbers in 2019, but still look quite strong. In Ontario, we have a 3-point Liberal lead, which is below where the Liberals were in the last election, but there are some polls that earlier in this campaign suggested the Conservatives were actually taking the lead in Ontario. I think Ontario right now, anyways, it's trending back toward the Liberals. And then a very interesting phenomenon I think is happening in Quebec. We have the Bloc and the separatist Bloc Québécois and the Liberals more or less tied. But again, there's been a number of polls out, even in the last few days, that suggest the Bloc might be dropping in Quebec. We aren't seeing that yet in our numbers, but it's something to anticipate as perhaps people no longer feel excited about Mr. Blanchet, the Bloc leader. Now, as in many countries around the world, Canadians don't have to vote in this election. And so I think it's even more prudent in understanding the state of the race to look at those who say they are definitely going to be voting. In our sample, that's about 68 to 69% of respondents. And in this case, when we only look at those respondents, you can see the Conservatives actually have an advantage, right? Their supporters are generally older, more likely to vote, in some cases more energetic and excited about voting for the Conservatives. And so they have a 2-point advantage. And you can see from last week, not a lot of change in our numbers. So these numbers, unlike some of the daily tracking polls that you might see, our polling has been much more consistent and stable, which I think makes some sense. And what you often see in telephone surveys is, and I'm not going to get into a deep methodology talk here, but I think if you're answering the phone and willing to give 10 minutes of your time to a survey, it may be driven by how excited you are at any given moment for one of the political parties. Where when we do these surveys online like we do, we're basically inviting everybody into it, and people don't know what the survey is about. And so response bias isn't as big as a factor. Now, I'm a big fan of the CBC poll tracker. Basically, it's an aggregator just to give you a sense of what all the polls are saying. I'm not of the belief that only Abacus polls are the best polls. I think we need to get a bigger picture. And what the average of the polls are saying is the Conservatives have just over a 2-point lead over the Liberals. And what I've shown you here is how they differ from our last survey. So not a lot of difference in the polls. There's 1 or 2 polls that sometimes seem outside of what the rest are saying, but there's fairly clear consistency when you consider the margin of error of these surveys and how much they should vary from firm to firm and time, and the timing of when they were conducted. So that's the state of the race. Very close. I don't do seat projections, but if I've looked at some of the different models, these kind of vote would certainly give us a minority government. Some suggest it gives the Conservatives a slight advantage in terms of the number of seats. Some suggest the Liberals are. So right now, your guess is as good as mine in terms of how the seats play out, but there's no doubt in my mind that it's very close. So what's driving these numbers? Well, if we look at the federal party leaders, which like in many countries, I think are a big predictor of how people vote and how they think about the political party. When we compare positive and negative impressions that Canadians have of these leaders, there's not a whole lot of difference. Mr. Trudeau has a slightly higher negative than positive. Mr. O'Toole's also more negative than positive, but that's improved over the course of the campaign. The New Democrat leader, Mr. Singh, continues to be the most popular leader in terms of his, what we would say, net favorables, subtract the negatives from the positives. And Ms. Paul, the Green Party leader, you can see many people don't really know her still. I don't think if she hasn't very often left her own electoral district in downtown Toronto throughout this first more than half of the campaign. And so she hasn't really seen many people get to know her or feel any better. And she actually has double the number who view her negatively than positively. Not a great place for a party that always struggles to get attention when your leader's not even that popular or well regarded. And to give you a sense of how net impressions have changed. So this is the number, again, when you take positives and you subtract negatives. At the end of the 2019 campaign, Justin Trudeau had a -7. Today, he's at -5. And at the start of the campaign, it was -4. really important that people's views of the Prime Minister haven't really changed all that much. There was a period during the pandemic where a lot more people had a positive view of him. But as I've been saying more recently, I think what this campaign has done is it's transitioned the Prime Minister from being, Prime Minister Trudeau to being candidate Trudeau. And when you become a politician full-time, people who didn't like you before or had some reservations, they're reminded of that. And so it's a different environment for the Liberal leader to be in when he's not the Prime Minister dealing with a crisis and talking to Canadians as a leader as opposed to a politician. So I think that's important. For Mr. O'Toole, Mr. Scheer, the previous Conservative leader, ended the 2019 campaign at -16. When the campaign started, Mr. O'Toole was quite negative at -21. He has improved. Now, the challenge for the Conservatives and Mr. O'Toole is most of that gain has been among those that are already inclined to vote Conservative. He's made only marginal improvements in his image among those who didn't vote Conservative last time. There has been some, but not enough that is really going to position him to overcome the Prime Minister at this stage. He's got an opportunity tonight and tomorrow to continue to introduce himself, to differentiate himself from the Prime Minister. But there's no doubt he's campaigned very well and has improved his image. Finally, for Mr. Singh, he ended the 2019 campaign in a very much same place as he is today, +16. Today it's +19. The New Democrats got 16% of the vote in that election, despite the fact they had a popular leader. So that doesn't bode well for Mr. Singh in that he is still popular, but it doesn't automatically mean people are going to vote for him. In fact, there's a large number of people in our survey who say, I really like him. I think he's a nice guy. I think he's compassionate. He's passionate, but I would never vote NDP. And that's because of where that party is on many issues and how people view the party and its viability for government and what it would do if it did win the election. So lots of goodwill that hasn't converted into support. A few other metrics I think that are important to consider. I do believe, especially when you have an incumbent government that's been in power for 6 years, is to measure the desire for change. And we ask it in an interesting way. We ask it almost on a scale. So those who definitely want to change in government, that's this darker gray line at the top, all the way to those who definitely want to see the Liberals reelected. And you can see that definitely reelect Liberal number hasn't moved between a band between 17 and 20%. So they haven't, even over the course of the pandemic, built up a lot of more people out there who said, oh, we definitely need to reelect the Liberals. And this is a real challenge for the Liberals in this election, is they don't have a lot of enthusiasm. There's not a whole lot of people who say, I love the Prime Minister, I love the Liberals, and that's pulling them out to vote. What's happening is if the Liberals are going to win this election, it's because a lot of voters look at the alternatives and say, I might like change. And that's this key group, this white line. They say, I want change, but it's not that important. But I'm not ready to give it to anybody else. But it is important to note that since June, those who say they definitely want to change in government has risen by over 10 points. And even in the course of the campaign, that number has gone up. So if you look back to 2019, the Liberals won. They didn't win the popular vote, but they won the most seats. They did that when half or just over half of the country they definitely want to change. They're still below that number, but over the next week and a half, if this number rises over 52%, that's an indicator, I believe, that the Liberals are in real jeopardy of losing this election and that the desire for change is going to overwhelm them. Why? Because when we ask people how they would vote based on their view of change, you can see that if you fall into this definitely want change group, right now at 49%, very few are saying they're going to vote Liberal, which makes sense. But for those who say they want change, but it's not important that change happens, you can see the Liberals are actually slightly ahead of the New Democrats and the Conservatives. And so if this group starts to move up, they're more likely to move out of the Liberal column. And that's a real problem. For the opposition parties, the fact the Liberals are still getting a third of those who want some change, but it's not important, means they haven't galvanized that change, that change isn't urgent, and that change isn't overcoming the fact that people might be uncomfortable with who might replace Mr. Trudeau and the Liberals going forward. So this, I think, gives us a nice sense of where the electorate's head's at when it comes to the parties. Briefly, in terms of issues, there's been a lot of issues discussed in this campaign. When you ask voters, what are your top two? The cost of living, improving healthcare, growing the economy, climate change, and housing affordability are really in the top five. Obviously, depending on what life stage you're in, what your political orientation is, you're going to rank these issues differently. But this election, like in 2019, has largely been about the cost of living and affordability, housing prices. All the parties have put out pretty comprehensive housing plans. There's been some discussion about healthcare and long-term care, given that we're in a pandemic and people, I think, are feeling even more vulnerable about the health system. But what you actually see when you go down this list is what's not. We're talking to diplomats here today. This election, despite it being called the day that Kabul fell, is not about foreign policy, is not about which of the leaders is going to do the best job on the world stage. Only 2% of Canadians say that one of their top two issues is representing Canada internationally, and only 2% say dealing with the crisis in Afghanistan is their top issue. So, the focus is much more on a domestic pocketbook, healthcare, climate change kind of conversation. Now, obviously, climate change is a global issue, as is the pandemic, but it's being discussed much more through a domestic, local lens than one in terms of Canada's role internationally. Quickly, we ask voters who they think is best on these same issues. Just quickly going through this. Cost of living, the number one issue. Mr. O'Toole has a slight advantage, but none of them have a clear advantage, which is why I think this race is so close. On making housing more affordable, same thing. Mr. Singh slightly ahead of the other two, but we're talking 2 points. That's basically a tie. So no one's clearly differentiated themselves. Improving healthcare, the Liberals have a slight advantage here, but even Mr. O'Toole, who got caught up in a conversation about, his views on privatizing certain elements of the system, whether he would or wouldn't, still has 1 out of 5 people who say he'd be best on that issue. So it's not yet become something that's, I think, pulling down the Conservative vote. On climate change, we do see the Liberals with a pretty clear advantage. They have a 9-point lead over Mr. O'Toole. Mr. Singh, you can see well back. The Green Party used to win this category. Now only about 10% of Canadians think the Green Party would be the best on this issue. It shows how well the Liberals and Mr. Trudeau have done at branding themselves as the climate change party. Activists and those who care deeply could argue that they haven't done enough in the 6 years they've been in power. But right now, when you ask people who's best on it, the Liberals have an advantage. On growing the economy, Mr. O'Toole has a nice 6-point advantage. This is something we often see for Conservative politicians in Canada. But for Mr. Singh, well back in third, often an Achilles heel for the New Democrats on managing the economy. One issue that has the Liberals in particular tried to put into the public consciousness is when we ask people, who do you think's best at getting more people vaccinated and getting the country back to normal quicker? You can see here the Liberals have a big advantage. That's why the Prime Minister and the Liberals want to talk about this. That's why I think, despite the protests and some of the violence that we're seeing, and I hate to say that they don't mind it, but it creates the contrast and unfortunately divides sort of the unvaccinated with the vaccinated. And you can see why, because the Liberals really have a clear advantage on that question. Finally, even though only 2% of Canadians say dealing with Afghanistan is a top issue for them, when we ask people who do you think would be better at dealing with it, you can see why the Prime Minister doesn't want to really talk about it, because he doesn't have an advantage on this. He leads on representing Canada internationally, but when it comes to Afghanistan, I think there's no clear winner here, and Mr. O'Toole does perform quite well. And it's probably divides by how you vote. If you're a Liberal, you think Mr. Trudeau's good on this issue. If you're Conservative, Mr. O'Toole. So the big picture of these issues is there are some differentiators. There's some parties that do better than others, but this race is so close that voters aren't differentiating these parties very clearly on many of these big issues. A few more points. I think this is, as a political scientist, probably the most important question to understanding where this election goes. We ask people, who do you think is going to win the election? Not who you're going to vote for, but who do you think is going to win? And what we find today is that a slightly more people, by 7 points, think the Liberals are going to win this election. 30% think the Conservatives, and then 7 NDP, and interestingly, 22% are not sure. But what's important is how this number has changed. When the election was called, 48% of people thought the Liberals were going to win, and only 18% thought the Conservatives were going to win. And so there's an increasing perception that this race is not just close, but that the Conservatives can actually win it. And based on some of the polls that have come out, that thinking is correct. I do think there's a good chance the Conservatives can win this election. So why does that matter? Well, it matters because, as I'll talk about in a minute, in Canada, because of our political system, our first past the post, single member plurality system, it's not proportional, meaning your first preference, you may not ultimately vote for your first preference because you're trying to prevent an outcome you really don't want. And there are many people who would much rather have a Liberal government than a Conservative one. Right now across the country, about 60% say they'd prefer a Liberal government if the only choice was only Liberal Conservative, as opposed to 40% who say, I want some kind of Conservative government. The other thing to note about this campaign is we asked people, are you even open to voting for these parties? Just as a measure of how well the Conservative campaign has actually done to this point, they're the only ones other than the Bloc in Quebec who have increased the percentage of those who say they're open to voting for that party. And so the Conservatives have expanded their tent. They haven't converted more people yet, but it does suggest it'll be easier for them than it was when this campaign started to potentially win. It's another indicator. Last point, could strategic voting be a factor, as I mentioned? And we are looking at two key groups of voters, what I call the NDP Liberal switchers. These are people who put their first or second choice as the Liberal or the New Democrat, and they represent 18% of the electorate. So that's a lot of people who are switching, potentially could switch between these two parties. 41% of them say they haven't firmed up their mind. So they're still much more open to changing their mind than those that are firm in their views. And when we ask people how would you vote today, the Liberals are ahead by 30 points among this group, and they've gained 8 points over the last year. So we're seeing some consolidation among this group. If perceptions that the Conservatives are going to win continues to go up, if people fear that outcome and expect the Liberals to continue to do it, their conversation about gun control this week, I think, is all intended to push those NDP Liberal switchers back or to the Liberals. That's a key indicator group. If this happens, if the Liberals get 70 to 80% of this group, then I think their re-election is reassured. And if they get even more, getting to a majority may not be completely out of the question. On the other side of the switcher divide is those who say their first or second choice is either the Conservative Party or the Liberals. Much smaller group, only about 7% of the electorate. And you can see right now that the Liberals and Conservatives are basically evenly split of this group. So for the Conservatives, in order to win the most seats, to win a majority, they basically have to win all of those voters. Their path to a majority is much harder than it is for the Liberals. They've got to do much better here. And so much of this campaign has been about making these switchers comfortable with the idea of a Conservative government and wanting the Liberals out of power. And so far, they haven't really delivered on that. But that margin has shrunk a little bit, but they still have significant work to do. Also note that more than half of this group say they could change their mind before they vote coming forward. So what does all this to mean? What do you watch for? I think there's 4 things. Obviously, it would be remiss of me not to say that the debates tonight and tomorrow could be important. People always ask me, are the debates going to matter? I think the debates always matter. It's whether or not they move the numbers or not. People often assume that the numbers have to move if the debates are going to matter, but the debates could matter if they reinforce what people already think. If they take, if people tuning in are open to voting Liberal or Conservative, they're leaning Liberal, and what they hear from Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole confirms that inclination, well, that debate mattered, but it didn't move people away from their original position. So I think these are opportunities to compare and contrast voters in a way that, the leaders in the way that voters rarely get. And so I think they are important moments. We've seen some evidence that the Liberals are starting to slowly consolidate that progressive vote. At 21%, the NDP that's too high if you're a Liberal. It's great news if you're a New Democrat, but the Liberals need that number to be much lower, closer to 16%, especially since that the Greens seem to have really struggled. And so will they start continuing to put pressure on the Conservatives and those progressive voters to come and rally to stop Aaron O'Toole? I think you saw some of that this week, and it may continue, and it needs to continue for the Liberals if they're gonna really pull this off. For the Mr. O'Toole I think now the big question is, can he handle the increased scrutiny that's going to come? As more and more people believe he can win, as the media start to talk about that possibility, the Liberals in particular, but also the public, are going to be listening very intently to how credible Mr. O'Toole appears. And the flip-flopping that he's done this week on guns is not a reassuring signal to voters who are worried about some elements of the Conservative Party on issues like social issues like abortion, same-sex marriage and equality, on climate change. The Conservatives have tried to moderate themselves, and Mr. O'Toole's really worked hard to appear and position himself as just, a moderate version of a progressive conservative that you might easily vote for. But if you start chipping away at that, and they've been very effective at keeping their candidates quiet, that puts pressure on those progressive voters to move. And then the last point is, it does feel like to me, when I recall back to 2019 and trying to think about where we were, that the electorate looks very similar. People are pretty locked in on their views of Mr. Trudeau. They're pretty locked in on their views of the Conservative Party, even if they might be more inclined to think Erin O'Toole's a nice guy. They still are, there's apprehension about the Conservatives. And so those two main parties seem to be in the same position. What's different is what's happening around them. You've got the People's Party that's pulling, certain types of voters who are really upset with restrictions and vaccines, and even the Conservatives. You've got the New Democrats that have a very popular leader and are continuing to effectively talk about the fact that Mr. Trudeau says he's a progressive, but doesn't act like one when he has the ability to do things. And then you've got the weakness of the Greens. So it does create more variability around the edges, but the fact remains that those two parties are increasingly kind of dug in terms of people's views of them, that I'm waiting to see whether anything can get people to kind of swing away from those and change their mind. So fascinating election. Public opinion, again, those horse race numbers aren't changing all that much, but it's the underlying things that this campaign has changed that to me signals still a lot of uncertainty, and the fact that not a whole bunch of people have paid attention to the first 2 weeks. I think there's interest in this campaign. It's increasing, and we'll see what turnout's like and whether or not any of these two parties kind of tied right now can break free, or this is an election that leaves us with almost the exact same parliament that we had when it was called. So Maureen, I will end there and hand it back to you.
Thanks, David. That was both comprehensive and fascinating, really full of important information, what to watch for everyone interested in this election, the desire for change, what's going to happen with strategic voting. I was monitoring the Q&A box during your presentation. There are questions. I mentioned earlier that you will answer questions as part of the session following our panel. And before I introduce our panel, I will remind the audience about the brief entitled, What Diplomats Need to Know About the Canadian Election. The brief is co-written by Colin Robertson, Vice President of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. It's available on the CGAI website, cgai.ca. And of course, it's also available on the Parliamentary Centre website, parlcent.org. And now, let me introduce our panel. All commentators, all very well known. I'm sure that all of you have read Susan Delacourt in this Toronto Star. She's a columnist, veteran journalist, and author of 4 political books, including Shopping for Votes, How Politicians Choose Us, and We Choose Them. Joël-Denis Bellavance is Ottawa Bureau Chief for La Presse. He's been covering Parliament, federal politics, and the role of Quebec in Canada for the past 25 years. Christopher Waddell is a professor emeritus at Carleton and a former director of the Carleton School of Journalism. He's a journalist and a commentator, former national editor for the Globe and Mail, and for years, the CBC Parliamentary Bureau Chief responsible for election coverage. So please use the Q&A function to ask questions. We'd like to give priority to diplomats. Do feel free to identify yourself and your country, and we will try to ask the most popular questions, so please vote for the ones you'd like to see answered. So my first question is to Susan Delacourt. And Susan, as I mentioned, you've been covering federal campaigns really since the 1980s. How is this campaign different from your point of view?
I think, hello and welcome everybody, and thank you for having me here. I'm honored to be. When I first started covering politics, by the way, Chris Waddell was my boss. So I always want to defer to him. I'm conscious of, yeah, I hope
Thanks,
I don't
Susan.
say anything wrong. So this one to me is different because the pandemic, of course, which is an obvious thing to say. But I think what's been occurring to me over this is just like the pandemic has broken the rules of politics and sort of the world as we know it, and Donald Trump did too. We've had an election since Trump though, but it feels like all the normal ways in which we measure campaigns and the things we use to judge where things are going, and David's excellent presentation there. Usually we try to figure out our elections about hope or fear. And I don't know whether, I don't know how people are defining hope and fear in a campaign like this. Or are they about change and stability? That's the other axis. And you see that the opposition, the Conservatives, are fighting a campaign about stability, and the incumbent usually is talking about stability, but people associate Justin Trudeau, I think, with change and turmoil and all the things that have been. So my roundabout way of saying this campaign is different to me in that I think we're on different sort of bearings here. Certainly those protests that have been dogging the Prime Minister are a new thing. I was in one of them, and they're not pleasant. They're kind of frightening, actually. So I don't know an election in which I've felt more that I don't know how it's going to go, and I think there are still major surprises coming.
Okay, Susan, I'm going to come back to you on the toxicity of the campaign in the next round. So I do want to carry on that theme, but I want to go to JD next and ask him about Quebec. Quebec was the province that denied Justin Trudeau a majority in 2019. Voters there have either listened to or heard about the TVA debate last week, but as we heard from David, it didn't seem to be moving the needle. David, can you explain to our audience what they should be looking for coming out of tonight's French leaders debate and the next week in Quebec?
The famous mute.
Okay, JD, are we? Can you?
Yes. There you go. Sorry
okay,
about that.
Perfect. Good.
Yes.
Whatever you said is brilliant.
Yes, I was saying that surprisingly, the political situation in Quebec has been very, very stable. Usually Quebec is a bag of surprise. You see things moving and you see waves coming up in Quebec that affect the political dynamics across the country. I would mention the 1993 wave that brought the Bloc Québécois as a separatist party, the official opposition party in the House of Commons. That was a wave that was surprising. And then you go to 2011, you got the orange wave that brought the NDP to the doors of government. They formed the official opposition for the first time in its history. And in 2015, Quebec supported the Liberal Party en masse and helped Justin Trudeau rise from the third place to the first place and allowed Mr. Trudeau to govern. So I was expecting things to be moving more in Quebec this time, but it's surprisingly very stable. And shockingly, the province where you see more movement is in Ontario, where this province has been historically more stable than Quebec. So it's a bit of a reversing role for Quebec and Ontario, the two biggest provinces in Canada. I would say that Mr. Trudeau, as a result of the debate that he had last week, managed to consolidate the base in Quebec. So that allows him to still hope for at least form the next government, depending on how the situation does evolve in Ontario and in some regions in Atlantic Canada. The Conservative Party leader, Erin O'Toole, managed to make his first introduction to Quebecers last week. I think he did okay. And everybody that was on the debate set spoke French very well. So we're very, well-deserved, well-served, by the master of the one of the two official languages, because all leaders who were attending the TVA debate debated very effectively in their second or first language. And it will be the same thing tonight with the addition of Alumni Paul, the Green Party leader, who will be there tonight. So I would say, though, that the fact that the Green Party leader will be there for the first time may hurt more the NDP, I would say, than any other party, because so far we've seen support from the Green Party going to the NDP, but will Madame Nicole, the Green Party leader, be able to reverse that trend? That remains to be seen, but that at the end of the day could also help the Liberal Party manage to win more support if the Green Party eats away at support that is now under the NDP.
Thanks, JD. And I'm going to turn to Chris Waddell now. And Chris, we're obviously talking about Ontario and Quebec. David has given us data on all of the regions and what are the most important issues. But you always make the argument that our election is really 338 concurrent elections held in different regions. So the information on the issues, obviously there'll be different importance in different regions. Is there a national issue? Can there ever be a national issue that unites all Canadians?
Oh, I think there have been in the past, free trade election in 1988 being one, and you can go back earlier than that, even back in the 70s with Mr. Trudeau's father, wage and price controls, maybe in 1974, that debate. I think if there's a national issue that unites everybody at the moment, I'll pick up a few words of what David said, and that's when he described things as being not a lot of enthusiasm. I think generally there isn't a lot of enthusiasm across the country. I'm chairing a committee, a group of voters for the CBC ombudsman who are listening to CBC radio during the campaign and reporting and writing notes about what they think about what the campaign and how CBC radio is covering the campaign. We had a meeting on Sunday. I asked them, do they have what's the most important issue in their region? Is there one issue that everybody is thinking about? And I've got a person in New Brunswick who is a community arts worker, a university student in Montreal, a farmer west of Toronto, just outside Milton. I threw that in for Susan because that's where she's from. Another farmer and municipal politician in Southern Alberta, an Indigenous Band Council member north of Saskatoon, and a postal worker, a mail carrier in Vancouver. The thing they say about the election is they see very few lawn signs. They see very little sign that people are engaged. One of them didn't even know what parties were running in their constituency because they can't see any signs or any evidence of what the parties are. Speaking only on my own behalf, I've not received anything in my mailbox from any party, except I got one early on from the Conservatives, just identifying who the Conservative candidate was. In my constituency, the Green Party candidate appears to be named Mr. Green Party, as his signs don't have any name on them. I think maybe that's the timing of the election. Maybe that's COVID. I think that what the hidden issue for longer term out of all this may be, I think we may be seeing the collapse of the party system at the local level across Canada, in that I don't think there are workers. I don't think there are people engaged at that level. And what that's going to mean for politics is quite interesting. A couple of things everyone should watch in the short term, though. I thought it was very interesting. Elections Canada, prior to the election, was talking about 4 to 5 million people voting by mail. On Sunday, there was a number released that 450,000 have asked for mail-in ballots. That's only about 12, you can't do the math, but it's only about 12 or 1,300 people per riding. That's nowhere close to the 4 or 5 million. That's not going to happen. Whether that means people aren't engaged or whether that means they decided they're going to go vote or not, I don't know. The other indication about whether people have any enthusiasm may be the advanced polls that are coming up this weekend. It's Friday to Monday, all 4 days. In 2019, almost 4.7 million people voted in the advanced polls. That was up significantly from about 3.6 million in 2015, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be more people voting, because in fact, in 2019, fewer people voted than in 2015. So we can watch that and see. Elections Canada may have released something next week about how many people are actually going to vote, but there doesn't seem to be, the issues that David talked about are all issues that people raise in different parts of the country, but there isn't one issue that's galvanizing people, I don't think.
Okay, thanks for that. And I'm going to come back to you a little later on voter turnout, but going back to Susan and toxicity, and you mentioned that you'd been at the event, and I saw that one of the protesters. Now, we've always had hecklers, but this seems much more intense and on a different scale. And I just want to refer to Samara Canada. They analyzed 350,000 online comments in the first week, showing that 20% were toxic and another 7% were severely toxic, including, and I'm quoting, hateful, aggressive comments or threats of violence against candidates or their families. And I think it's the first time we've had a Canadian election misinformation project. Are we starting to go down the US path and become more polarized, or how, talk to us a little bit further about this toxicity, which, is horrifying people?
Yeah, it is quite horrifying. I think that one of the things that stops Canada from being polarized is the fact that we are a federation and we have multiple parties. That it's very hard to do the evil good thing when you've got so many political parties. But definitely this prime minister is a polarizing figure. He makes people, he said it himself long before he took power, he makes conservatives nutty. And I think all of us would say, I know we all have friends who despise this prime minister. He seems to make people very angry. He also makes a lot of people like him. He's popular, but nothing like the anger that he whips up. So some of that has been borrowed from the United States for sure. The crowd that I saw in Cambridge, Ontario, was calling themselves deplorables after Hillary Clinton. They were also yelling, "Lock him up." A lot of the phrases were lifted from Trump rallies and brought to Cambridge, Ontario. And I think they were enjoying that. What struck me about these protesters, I think they still are a small fringe, but is their absolute lack of deference to authority. They were contemptuous, not just of Trudeau, but the police that were there. There was racist things, I just won't even go there, hurled at Black RCMP officers. It was a little bit unnerving. My reporter friends who were on the Friday night one in Bolton, Ontario, told me they felt personally threatened. They thought that if the crowd had made it through, they might have hurt them. I didn't have that sense myself in Cambridge, but I also knew that I'd never seen anything like it before. I think a couple of the reporters said that watching these protests is like watching Twitter come to life. That it's poured off the screen and onto, and certainly it's being enabled by all of this. And they're being fed lines from, I don't know, the dark web or something like that, I had one protester come up to me and say that he felt sorry for me because I did not understand that the prime minister was heading up a child sex trafficking ring. And that if I just did my research, I would understand this, and that he's very worried about the children. And that's, again, shades of the kind of stuff that you saw in the United States, right? So that's my long-winded way of saying this stuff is disturbing. I think it's at a level we haven't seen before, but I think our multi-party system, our federation, will protect us from going totally down the road of the United States. Other panelists may disagree.
Chris has got his hand up, so sure, but Chris, unmute yourself. They're good.
I did. Since I'm the old guy here, I think, his father was a pretty polarizing figure too. Some of us who are old enough may remember T-shirts that were produced after Mr. Trudeau was traveling through Salmon Arm, BC, and he gave a bunch of demonstrators the finger out the window of a train, which shows you how much things have changed in terms of what people travel on these days. And even much of his success in 1968 may have been attributed to his ability to stand up the demonstrators at the Saint-Jean-Baptiste Day Parade in Montreal. So he's a polarizing figure, but I don't disagree with what Susan's saying about the nature of it. I think to some degree, Trump and I also think Rupert Murdoch media in the United States has made it acceptable to launch violent threats against people, to attack people verbally and even physically. And that's, there's a degree to which that's spread over the border.
Okay. Jay, did you want to jump in on this one too and talk about the situation in Quebec?
I would agree with Susan that because we have four main parties that are rejecting that kind of statement, I think it's sort of a keep it to the fringes, marginal forces. And the main party that is fueling it is the Parti populaire du Canada, the People's Party of Canada, that is being led by Maxime Bernier. And what is reassuring is that Mr. Trudeau's party obviously is rejecting this. Erin O'Toole's party also taking his distance from this kind of crowd. And also Jagmeet Singh, who said that he was shocked to see in 2021 that you don't throw rocks at people with whom you disagree. So that was quite the statement by Mr. Singh yesterday. I think it put things into perspective. So fortunately, we have grown-ups leading our parties right now. But if ever one of the parties is being taken over, like in the United States, by somebody who has a dangerous position or discourse on some of these issues, we might see, we may not be able to say the same thing. So we are keeping this kind of behavior at bay because the four main parties are rejecting it. But if there is ever a day when a political party is being taken over, like the United States, that may be a different situation. In Quebec, we've seen also a protest in Quebec directed at the current premier, François Legault. And the current premier is very popular in Quebec because of the way he fought the COVID and managed the COVID pandemic. But still, there is some noise in some of the streets in Quebec that are being taken at authorities. And that's something that Susan mentioned, it's at authorities. So that is not being taken at a particular party in Quebec, but it's the authorities. However, on the federal scene, we haven't seen the kind of events that Susan described in Cambridge and Bolton so far in Quebec. So that's something that I'm watching right now. And I think it's pretty quiet on that front. Will it change after the debates? That remains to be seen.
Okay, great. I'm just about ready to open it up to audience Q&A, but I just have to, because diplomats are always interested in the role that foreign policy plays in our election. And now David did refer to it, that it's not a topic that's moving voters, but let's just go into that a little bit more deeply. Chris, does this campaign compare to 2015, for example, when perceived government, conservative government inaction in helping Syrian refugees and the snitch line for barbaric cultural practices did play a role? This time around, we're talking about Afghanistan, but also the imprisonment of the two Michaels, maybe a disappointment that many Canada-US irritants continue, and there are new ones, such as the continued closure of the border. There's also Haiti and the diaspora politics. So talk a little bit about any foreign policy issue playing a role.
It's a good question. I don't think they really are. I think probably that, or I would guess that maybe because it's not really clear how anyone else would have done any better on any of them. It's easy for a party that's in opposition to sort of say, we might have done something different or something better. In Afghanistan, I suspect it's the fact that we really haven't been there for almost a decade. And it's not, and even when we were there, it really wasn't an issue that galvanized Canadians very much. It affected the people who lost people who were killed there in the communities in which they live, which tended to be rural communities rather than urban communities. But it didn't really Afghanistan was never really a major issue in Canada, I don't think. And so all the other issues, the biggest role that's probably played is taking up attention of the news media and space on newscasts and newspapers and online during the first 2 or 3 weeks of the election campaign. But COVID is a big part of that too. So I think David's numbers are probably about right. Usually foreign issues don't play a big role, and it's not clear that they're going to be this time. Okay,
thanks. Oh, what JD, jump in.
Yeah, it's true that we're not talking a lot about foreign policies in this election, except for the first 2 weeks because of the situation in Afghanistan. But if the election produced a different government, namely the Conservative Party, if they form government, will have different Canada's foreign policy, namely towards China, much harder line.
True.
And Huawei will be banned in Canada for sure in a very quick manner, and that may produce some more frictions between Canada and China. Secondly, we will also see, I think, the Conservative Party pushing for more free trade with some key countries like New Zealand and Australia. I know the Conservative is putting forward such a measure, and also a closer work between Canada and Australia, Great Britain, New Zealand, and United States on facing China, which the Conservative Party see as the biggest threat to international security.
Interesting. Susan.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, why it's different from 2015. And I think foreign policy only becomes an issue in Canadian elections when it gets somehow grafted or glued onto things happening domestically. The Syrian issue became a big one, as you alluded to, because there was a domestic debate going on about the wearing of the niqab and the hijab, and a perceived lack of tolerance by Conservatives of others here. So the two issues fit together. There's no real match yet, except competence, loosely, has Trudeau managed things competently. I am surprised that Canada-US has not come up more, because it's because of the borders, because Trudeau has a friendly president now, allegedly, and things have not got all that better. I don't know, some of the diplomats here may remember or know, in the last campaign in 2019, Barack Obama came out and endorsed Trudeau, and they were quite proud of that. We're not going to see that now in this election, any endorsement by the Democrats, because they're now in office. But it's, I think that the key thing to remember for all the diplomats here is foreign policy doesn't actually get Canadians excited unless they can see it somehow happening more locally.
I think, Susan, maybe the opening the border to Americans in early, fully vaccinated Americans in early August before the election probably took some of the sting out of that, and it allowed Canadians that Canadian communities that relied on American tourists and things like that to start to at least get some of that back.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. That was, I think, very helpful to our audience. And now I'm going to ask David Coletto to join the panel again, as well as Tom Cormier. And Tom has been monitoring the Q&A. Tom, what kinds of questions have you been seeing, and what are diplomats interested in knowing? And and direct a question.
Sure. Some activity there for sure. If I can pick up on this issue of foreign policy, a question that was upvoted 5 times. Any thoughts on how a Tory government would shift the foreign policy development agenda that has been so focused on a feminist agenda, setting aside whether it meets definition for international development, sexual and reproductive health? Any thoughts there on the feminist agenda in foreign policy?
Well, a brief one only, that of course, Mr. Harper, back when Canada hosted the G7, G20, I forget which was, came out of that with a big effort on maternal health in the developing world, which seems to have been greeted fairly positively and fairly successfully. But beyond that, don't know. Although the other thing in the Conservative document is the Conservatives, there's nowhere in the Conservative document, they say foreign aid spending generally will stay about where it is. There's no interest in moving it back towards the 0.7 that of course Canada doesn't get to anyway, because we're at about what, 0.1, 0.15 or 0.2. So there doesn't appear to be much interest in actually doing a lot more in terms of foreign aid spending.
But what is different this time is, if you recall, in 2019, Andrew Scheer ran on cutting foreign aid spending by 25%. And a few months ago, Erin O'Toole came out, or maybe it was even a year ago, came out and said, I will not do that. I will maintain the current spending. So I don't know their approach to foreign, how official development, their approach would be, but they have signaled they're not going to reduce the spending.
Right.
Okay.
If I may say a few words on this one, I would say that 3 issues will dominate the foreign affairs policy desk once this election is over. Obviously, China, whichever government is elected. We have 2 Michaels that are still detained in China. So that remains a priority. And eventually we'll have to make a decision on why it's been a while since we said there would be a decision coming up, but that will remain an issue. Secondly, the situation in Afghanistan is still very fluid. How will the Taliban behave in Afghanistan? And Canada has promised now to, Mr. Trudeau, his party has promised to bring in 40,000 refugees. So that will be an effort that will have to be conducted after the election, because so much is being stopped now because we're having this election. And thirdly, but also very important, how do we improve Canada's relationship with the United States? Susan alluded to it, that it's supposed to be our best friend, but there remain some frictions to be solved, namely softwood lumber, Buy American Act, and also the reopening of the border. So those are issues that I think will dominate the foreign desk once this election is over.
Okay. Some question as well about any thoughts on how the public would react to a parliament that may emerge as having a similar composition to what we had in 2019?
Well, I think the first question that will be asked is, what was that all about? And to me, the remaining issue is the fact that Mr. Trudeau has not been able to explain properly why we are having this election. I think 3 weeks, last week, this was the very first topic that was raised during the face-à-face on TVA, the first debate in French. Why are we having this election? And Mr. Trudeau had trouble justifying, and all the leaders there, Jagmeet Singh namely, said this was a useless election that should not have been called, and Erin O'Toole saying that this was only the election that was called because Mr. Trudeau wanted a majority. So usually the debate about calling the election, and Susan will agree with me, lasts about 24 hours, 48 hours. We are like almost more than midway through this election, and this remains an object of discussion. So that is not good news for the governing party that is seeking another mandate.
Yeah, I'd add to that I think there is a significant risk that in fact the situation will be less stable and more problematic than it was in the current parliament. In that the Liberals had the advantage in the current parliament of having 3 parties, any one of which they could choose to get enough support to get legislation through. So on things like Trans Mountain Pipeline or issues regarding energy, they could rely on the Conservatives, they could rely on the NDP for some things and rely on the Bloc for others. It's entirely possible that if the Liberals end up in a minority, there will be fewer people, either they'll have to rely on only one, or alternately they'll need to rely on 2 parties in order to get a majority. And if the Conservatives should end up in first place, that opens the whole question about who's actually going to support them and for how long. Or even if it's, I mean, David alluded to this early on, without getting into it, and I won't get into too much of it, is that Mr. Trudeau does have the right to meet the House, regardless of what the results are. And if he ends up with seats that are only slightly less than the Conservatives, and he thinks he can get the support of another party to get things through, we could end up in a much more fractious parliament and a situation that actually may contribute to some of the stuff Susan was talking about earlier about people not being very happy with the nature of how our democracy works.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I keep looking down the road and trying to imagine what's going to happen if the result is unclear. You know, whether it's that fringe at the end. I do worry, you know, the last election, the popular vote favored the Conservatives. You know, that is, if that happens again, there's going to be talk, not just from that fringe, but from Conservatives as well, about whether we have legitimate elections in Canada. You know, like whether the Liberals rigged the system. You know, I do not see that as an impossible line of inquiry. I think Mr. Trudeau, whether he realized it or not, set a very important test for himself in this election. He had to get more seats. If he does not get more seats than he won in 2019, he is a weakened leader. And I suspect Liberals will not want to be talking about this at the moment, though they are Liberals, they do, whether this is the last election of him as leader, right? I think there will be talk about Mr. Trudeau's leadership in a way that we're used to seeing. For any of you unfamiliar with the history of Liberal politics, is as long as I've been covering it, 30 years, they're always talking about who their next leader is. And
It was Mark Carney for 15 seconds.
yeah, it was Mark Carney, yeah. Christopher Freeland, whatever. It's so there's been a break in that during the Trudeau years. I think that hobby of the Liberals is going to return unless Mr. Trudeau gets more seats than he got in 2019.
Just quickly on that note, if I may, Chris alluded to that, and I think I want to add something. If Mr. Trudeau does win 133 seats, for example, but the Conservative wins 140 seats, so let Mr. Trudeau wins 10 seats less than the Conservative, he has the right to go see the Governor General and ask to form the government and have the support of the House. But this could provoke a constitutional crisis and could also allude to a drop of faith towards the political system in Canada, because first past the post makes less way, and also because Mr. Trudeau would have the constitutional right to do so, but there would have to be some pedagogy, if I may say in French, to educate the public about the legitimate nature of that move.
I was just going to add, we also can't deny that he just may not want the job anymore.
Yeah.
Because he's, worked pretty hard over 2 years getting through the pandemic, and, maybe he's done. And so that could be an easier way for him to walk away and say, I've done my job. So it's, I think the after election stuff is the stuff that a pollster can't help answer, but is going to be the more interesting conversations, because it's so uncertain right now.
A month into the pandemic, one of Mr. Trudeau's friends, who is not Jerry Butts, I won't say who it was, but one of Mr. Trudeau's longtime friends told me he was worried about the Churchill factor. That, as everybody knows, the example of Winston Churchill led Great Britain, probably the greatest crisis manager of all times, and got booted out by the voters the first chance they had. And that was on the minds of Trudeau's friends, that he could have the same situation as Winston Churchill. He would get associated with the pandemic and not the fix of it. That people see him as he did a great job, but we want to get past this, and you just remind us of all the stuff that we went through. And I think David would know this better as a pollster, but I think that's in the mix out there too. I think there's that by calling an election, Trudeau reminded them of the days when he was holding press conferences every day on the doorstep. And I've heard that anecdotally from people. It's, oh, come on, I just want everything to go away, right? Mm-hmm. And I like Chris, I live in probably the safest Liberal, Maureen too, I live in the safest Liberal riding in Canada, I believe. And I'm surprised at the angst and annoyance I'm hearing from my neighbors about the fact that we're having this election and they have to have politics in their face again.
One of the things
I want to ask David Coletto, just to inform our audience a little bit, because I know you've done some polling on how comfortable Canadians are with minority governments versus majority governments. And it used to be that we all liked majority governments and the government was easy. And now is there have you done any polling on historical trends on favoring minority or majority governments?
It's interesting. First of all, I don't know if people really think about it all that much and have really clear views. I think it depends on whether they've been primed to be thinking about stability versus instability versus, having one party having all the power versus that power being dispersed. And it really depends in the time. So Mr. Harper in 2011 effectively used years of minority government to signal, okay, enough's enough. But I don't think there's many Canadians who would look back at the past 2 years and say, this minority parliament has failed or it's been ineffective. In fact, by all indicators, government has done more in 2 years with a minority government than it did probably since after the Second World War, and its ability to act and move and get things done. Now, Parliament wasn't a big factor in all of that. They didn't actually meet, and there were times when they kind of delegated power to the executive to let them make those decisions. But still, so I'm not sure there's like a deep angst for so-called stability right now. I think to Susan's point, people like, I know this is how I feel, are just tired, right? They're just tired. And what was hoping to be a summer where we could kind of come out of this horrible period in a way, and I don't know if I blame the Prime Minister for this, and this is my opinion, and I'm kind of moving away from pollster Dave here, but like one of the key outcomes of this election will undoubtedly be, as we already talked about, a much more divided country, a much more angry country, a much and over something that we had been successfully not dividing ourselves on vaccines. So, and for that reason, the Prime Minister, if he doesn't win his majority, may not survive, because I think there will be lots of blame to go around that he left the country worse off because we had this election, not because who won or who didn't, just simply the state of the public's perspective will be, we are not better off now. And this is your fault because you called this election.
Yeah.
Which I think shows up in what you were talking about earlier, David, and I was mentioning too, in terms of lack of enthusiasm among the public. I mean, it's maybe a little harsh to describe it, but it almost feels to me like the whole election, people are kind of going through the motions, but it doesn't really feel like there's any engagement. But I'm going to pick, Maureen lets me, I'm going to pick up one thing that I wanted to talk about briefly.
And then we got to get back to Tom, because Tom's got to ask some more questions.
Okay, really quickly, the big thing that surprised me about this election is the last 3 elections have demonstrated that the Liberals do best when turnout is high. They had 68% in 2015 when they won. It went down 2% last time to 66. But when Mr. Harper won a majority in 2011, it was 61%. So I'm perplexed as to why they decided to have the election at a time that's virtually guaranteed to ensure turnout is going to be difficult, because people were on vacation. Anyone that was on vacation after the last year, as David noted, wants to be on vacation, doesn't want to care about this. And it's not rocket science to figure out that the first 2 weeks of September, everyone from grandparents to children, to parents with kids going into kindergarten are worried about school, and schools are issues and COVID are issues. So it seems, and they're also not getting the benefit, for what it's worth, of the advanced polls being on a holiday weekend, which they were in 2015 and 2019, and there were holiday weekends. There was Thanksgiving weekend both times. So to me, I don't understand why they chose a time to call an election when it's going to be very difficult to replicate the sort of turnout they had. And we go into the conservative side of it if you want later on, and I think we're headed towards not a turnout that's similar. You look at what happened in Nova Scotia, for instance, 55% of people turned out, which was like 2 percentage points higher than the lowest result they've ever had. Chris, I think it's partly because they assumed the conservative base wasn't excited, which they weren't. They were demotivated and not interested in it. But they made a huge
as soon as
mistake.
he made the election about vaccines, which is a winner if he gets the pro-vaccine side engaged, is what it's done is they've all said, and the anti-vaxxers have gotten super excited, and the protection of their rights becomes what's mobilizing that conservative base. But to their credit, so turnout will go up, will stay high for conservatives, but just not for Liberals, I think.
And yeah, but to the conservatives' credit, I think what the Liberals also hope was that Mr. O'Toole would run the sort of campaign that previous conservative leaders have run, and those who were in the country in 2019 might have remembered that Mr. Scheer, the conservative leader, started the debate against Mr. Trudeau by calling him a fraud, a phony, and not fit to be leading the country. Mr. O'Toole has done something totally different, and he's run a very different campaign. He looks happy. He looks like he's having a good time. He answers questions well. They seem to respond quickly when issues come up. Now you can agree with their answers or not. And so far it's been very successful for him, but should he end up in the same situation as Mr. Scheer, which was the party expecting they were going to win and then finding out they didn't, the reactions against Mr. O'Toole will probably be pretty fierce afterwards. But
okay. I love all you guys, and I love all your answers, but now we're going to be much tougher. Tom?
There you go. There's a question in the Q&A that talks about this prospect of a minority government, but as many of our diplomats will know, I come from countries where coalition governments are the norm. And so there is the question about, is there a prospect of a coalition government? And it'd be helpful for some of you to explain that phenomenon in Canada.
Want me to take the first step?
Please go ahead.
There's been talk, I was talking to Liberals, I think the show Borgen, everybody know that one? That had a little buzz and following earlier this year when everybody was binge watching, because it's the story of how coalitions work, right? And I've heard some people actually saying, wouldn't it be kind of interesting if Canada had that? We have never. I maybe wartime. Chris can correct me on that.
1917, First World War.
Yeah.
Liberals split, where some of them in Quebec were opposed to conscription. The rest joined the Conservatives to form a union government.
See what a great boss he was.
Yeah, providing you want to go back 100 years, Susan, I'm excellent.
He was Google before Google was invented. Anyway, we have not had that. There's been talk of it. We came very, very close in 2008, the so-called coalition crisis, when I won't go into all the details, but there was a proposal by the Liberals and New Democrats to form some kind of government. There were back and forth on whether NDP members would have cabinet seats under a Liberal prime minister. In fact, I think, funnily enough, people doing the negotiation there were Katie Telford, who is now the chief of staff to the prime minister, and Anne McGrath, who was then the chief of staff, and now she's chief of staff, or she has some role, I don't know her title exactly, with Jagmeet Singh. So the players are the same. There could be discussions about that, but I don't think either party is in a place to think about that right now. I don't know. It would be fascinating if it happened after the 20th, but I don't know that anybody's dancing around the idea of coalition at the moment. I would like it. I love Borgen, and I would love to see it. I'd love to see it in Canada.
Joël-Denis?
I wouldn't rule out a coalition, maybe not a formal one, but a sort of an agreement between the Liberal Party and the NDP to keep some key proposals that are currently on the table, namely the creation of a national daycare center. I wrote a story lately about that, and I was conversing the parties whether how they would react if the Conservative Party forms a minority government and try to abolish or tear apart the sort of deals that Ottawa signed with 7 provinces on creating a national daycare center. And all the parties, I mean, the NDP, the Liberals, and the Bloc Québécois said they would vote against any move by the Conservative minority government to abolish this, including if it means calling an election. But before calling an election, they might have some talks, try to revamp the sort of configuration of Parliament and arrive with a proposal where a new prime minister could emerge out of this, just to save a national program that a lot of people, a lot of families care about, which is a national daycare program that exists in Quebec provincially, but the federal Liberals want to expand it nationally to other provinces, and they have managed to sign deals before the election was called with 7 provinces and 1 territory. So this is a scenario where I could see sort of not a formal coalition government with the NDP cabinet, NDP MPs being in the cabinet, but a formal agreement to make sure they govern a few years to save this kind of deal.
Yeah, that's what happened. I mean, I won't get into the history, but that's what happened in Ontario when the second and third parties got together and the NDP and the Liberals in 1985 and agreed that 87 maybe 85 and good, Susan, thank you. But they agreed that their agreement would last for 2 years, and I think there would have to be something like that at a minimum, because the public doesn't want to have another election 12 months from now, which might otherwise be the case. But I think the chance of a coalition is probably reduced by the fact that in many parts of the country, the Liberals and the NDP are competing against each other, and certainly in urban areas, Liberals NDP tend to run first and second in a lot of cases. The suburbs tend to be more conservative, have a conservative element, and the best way for there to be a coalition might be if one party in fact had no representation in a significant part of the country, but another party did. But even when that happened back in the early 70s, Mr. Trudeau Sr. appointed, and there were no Liberals west of Manitoba, essentially. Mr. Trudeau appointed several senators to be in his cabinet and said there would be representation that way. So there's no real history of it as a formal thing, not even at the provincial level, actually.
Okay. This is an international crowd, obviously, and there's a question about the environment. And a question is, how would a minority government affect what's going to happen at COP26? They mentioned the election of Joe Biden in the US. Trudeau signaled convergence across North America on climate action and the green transition. Will this election put that in jeopardy, or what consequence might it have for COP26 coming up later this year? Any thoughts?
I see some debate about whether COP26 is going to happen, but that was just in the Financial Times in the last day or so, thanks to COVID. If it was the Liberals still in power, I would think it probably would be okay, because it would be both Bloc support and NDP support. If it's the Conservatives that are in power, the Conservative policies are very different than the Liberal Party, even though they've said they have will introduce a carbon tax. It's a very different sort of tax, and their approach is very different. We'd have to see what would happen.
Any other takers for that one? Okay. I know that Chris mentioned earlier that we haven't seen evidence of people voting in large numbers in advance or by postal voting, but nevertheless, there is strong interest in understanding among our participants whether increased mail voting would benefit a particular party. Any thoughts on that?
I don't think so. Oh, sorry, Joel, then go ahead.
Yeah, that's tough to measure because we don't have a tradition of voting by mail. In the last election, only 50,000 people voted by mail, and they were mostly from outside the country. And now we're trying to install this system. Voting by mail is very popular in British Columbia. In the last provincial election, a third of the voters there voted by mail. And I've checked, as Ian did too, the side of Election Canada. And interestingly, they have measurements of how many, where most of the mail-in ballots are coming from, or the demands for mail-in ballots. And they are coming from 9 out of 10 ridings are from British Columbia. So that tradition continues federally, but outside of British Columbia, there's not a big appetite. And it's very difficult to say which party would be favored by a massive take on a mail ballot by mail. So it's very difficult.
In our survey, sorry, go ahead, Susan.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say quickly, we asked earlier in the election, we asked people, how they intended to vote, and large numbers said I'd like to vote by mail, but I don't think it's showing up. But when you look at who said that, interestingly, there wasn't a big partisan difference, at least in intent. So whether that shows up in actual votes, but if only 5 or 6% of the ballots are cast by mail, that's unlikely going to be enough to change, the results in enough ridings that we won't know on election night what's happening. But if we did see, in the last, 3 days that you can apply for, or I guess 4 days, you can apply for a mail ballot. If we see a huge uptick, then we may be waiting a little bit longer. But I don't see the same kind of partisan divide that we saw in the United States between, Democrats voted by mail, Republicans voted in person, and yet sort of had to wait a week to find out what certain states were gonna go.
All the parties were trying to use these fancy little gadgets and widgets, and I'm aging myself by to get to text, to connect people by text, which is young people, to vote by mail. And I don't think that's been all that successful. I think the idea was to galvanize young people through these little apps and gadgets to go get a mail-in ballot. I don't think that's caught on, and all parties are trying.
Yeah, just to remind our audience that at the beginning, the Election Canada was expecting up to 5 million would use that new privilege of voting by mail, and they reduced that to about 500,000. It's going to be maybe up to 1 million, but it's not going to be as big as they expected.
And in the Newfoundland election, it was pretty much of a disaster. I think it didn't work very well at all, from what I understand. It meant the election went on for weeks before they actually knew what was going to happen. So, not that Newfoundland it's only 7 seats, but still.
Yeah.
So I have a question that some diplomats have asked me, and it's about Indigenous issues. And David's earlier pre-election polling showed an increase in concern about Indigenous issues, and the discovery of unidentified remains at residential schools has touched Canadians in a new way that seemed to position a new openness to reconciliation. And I'm not hearing a lot about that on the campaign trail. And has that concern gone away? Are there any ridings where Indigenous issues define the campaign? If someone can talk a little bit about that, Susan. I see your.
Yeah, I think the problem is it maybe it's not a polarizing issue between the parties, you know, that parties are pretty much aligned. Nobody's saying I'm going to do one thing about residential schools and not another. I think where this will have some effect is in 2015, as we've talked about, voter turnout was huge, and it was huge. It went up dramatically with Indigenous Canadians, Indigenous people. They're a huge turnout. Changed maybe, I think the past AFN chief said that they thought they affected the vote results in about 24 ridings across the country. I think that's the Liberals' problem in this one. I think it declined a bit in 2019, will be the enthusiasm quotient again, as Chris has alluded to, that Indigenous Canadians do not feel that that the great promise of 2015 has been delivered. You did hear, though, Natan Obed, the head of the Inuit, saying, sort of warning this week, trying to warn that a conservative government would reverse the progress they've seen. He said it very diplomatically, but he was saying, be careful to Indigenous people that there would be a reversal of progress they've made. But I don't, it's been interesting the ways in which that huge interest by people has not found a voice in this campaign. It's another strange thing about this strange election.
Just a word on that. I've read recently that we are seeing a record number of candidates from Aboriginal communities in this election. So this is good news. I would say that it means that the Aboriginal issues will not go away, no matter how we talk about it in this election campaign. Plus, in addition to that, the Prime Minister appointed a new Governor General in this July that comes from Aboriginal communities. So she will make sure that any government does not forget or put aside issues that are affecting Aboriginal people in Canada, and that's a good thing.
Okay, I'm going to follow up on that particular question, but I'm just a warning that in a couple moments, we're coming to an end. I'm going to ask each of you for just a very brief closing remark. But I want to follow up on the question of diverse candidates. And this is something that the Parliamentary Centre works at and is very interested around the world. And Canada, we pride ourselves on being diverse and inclusive, and we have racialized, Indigenous, and female candidates. But in past elections, parties have run many of those candidates in unwinnable ridings. Will the next House of Commons look similar to 2019 with maybe only incremental progress? And is it going to be more comfortable for female MPs? If we know that we've had instances of female MPs feeling very uncomfortable or racialized, being very uncomfortable and ask for credentials when their colleagues aren't. So anyone want to tackle that one?
I worry, I'm not going to predict because who knows, but I will say that the mood of this election and the toxicity that we've discussed is going to make it harder to recruit people like this to politics. And I regret that aspect of this campaign, that there are female candidates right now and racialized candidates saying they've been the victims of attacks and all of that. So I worry that this has been a total turnoff to getting the House of Commons. This unwanted election has made people not want to have anything to do with politics. I hear that a lot. So I think that's an unfortunate byproduct of it.
And to some extent, that's really just accelerating what's been going on for a while, and that over the last 5 years or so, particularly female MPs, but others as well, have faced certainly harassment on social media and in some cases attacks on their constituency offices and other things like that. So I agree with Susan that it's going to accelerate, but I don't know what the House is going to look like at the end. I suspect that if those issues may be subsumed within larger battles about democracy that we talked about earlier, depending on what the nature of the House is, what the composition of the House is like.
Okay.
I was a page in the House of Commons in 1986, 87, and all I saw were old white males and today I cover Parliament, and I think it does reflect more the population of Canada. And also, for the first time in 2015, the Prime Minister formed a gender-based parity cabinet, which I think has been the basis now that any new Prime Minister has to form his cabinet. There needs to be an equal number of women and men to make sure that all issues are dealt with properly with all the lenses of a woman, but also the lenses of a man.
Okay. All right. So time for closing remarks, like a minute each. I'll let you figure out who wants to go first and who wants to go last. And David Coletto, you're included in this minute. JD?
Well, maybe I'll start. I'll start it off. You know, I don't know what else to add. I think this was a really interesting conversation. I'm still of the view that there is enough people out there who either haven't paid all that much attention yet, and even if they don't have really firm views, that, which is maybe a cop-out, we either going to see a big change in the next week or no change at all. But I think the evidence and the data suggest either of those could happen, which has been the case in Canadian politics for maybe 2 decades now, right? JD mentioned Quebec and how it has swung, you know, pretty aggressively in different directions. I don't think it's the likelier outcome, but there may be a bulb that just goes off and people say, I'm either done with Mr. Trudeau or I'm fine with the status quo and I just wish we didn't have this election. And that's, I think, the choices that the 2 paths that we're going to likely follow.
Okay.
I'll leap in now. I don't know that I have anything profound to say, but it's been striking me through this campaign that when the history of it is written, it may well be the mental health campaign, that I think the nation is in very fragile emotional state. And I think that the best way to understand it is almost to understand it as this. Just before the 2015 election, I was clipped. John Oliver, the comedian, clipped me in one of his things because I was referring to Trudeau's emotional intelligence, and he was mocking that. So I think there's an irony in the fact that this Prime Minister, who is supposed to have huge emotional intelligence, has set off an election that really is emotional in unpredictable ways, that we really don't know what's on the mind, but it feels like the nation's emotions are fragile and unpredictable right now.
Okay.
I would say that this election, the result of it will probably be in sort of a tradition that has been put on the table for the last few elections, which is the minority government. Since 2004, we've had 2004, 2008, 2004, 2006, yeah, 2008, plus 2019. So we had 4 minority parliaments in the last 20 years. I expect the 5th one on September 20th. So that means more, if I may say, negotiations, more compromise, maybe more frictions also, because that's the nature of a minority parliament. So I expect to be very busy again after the 20th of September.
And I guess I'll just finish up by saying I agree with what everyone else has said. And I still think it remains an open question whether people decide to show up and vote or not. Because I do think there's a lot of people who just are kind of, as I think it was Susan said, they've got other things going on in their lives and they're worried about everything else. And they don't see enough of a difference coming up by choosing one or choosing the other to actually decide they have to get out and force that. But we may also see some other interesting things. I mean, the Green Party clearly is in serious trouble. And I think the question David raised earlier about where the bloc is going to be might end up being kind of interesting as well. But it's, I think and we won't know who's going to vote until we actually get to September 20th late in the evening.
Okay, well, to be continued. I'd really like to thank David Coletto, Susan Delacourt, JD Bellavance, and Chris Waddell for sharing, your knowledge and your insight with us today. I learned a lot. I hope that all of you did as well. Of course, I'd like to thank Tom Cormier for consolidating the questions and for his earlier remarks about the Parliamentary Centre and its new partnership with Carleton University. And now here to offer some closing remarks on behalf of Carleton, I'd like to introduce the President and Vice Chancellor, Dr. Benoit Antoine Bacon. President Bacon.
Thank you so much, Maureen, and good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Merci d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. It was so interesting, truly wonderful session with all our thanks here at Carleton to our distinguished presenters and panelists, David Coletto, Chris Waddell, Suzanne Delacourt, J.D. Bellavance. So enlightening, and it's great to see all the Carleton connections as well. We really hope that everybody's enjoyed this very special election primer as we all keep an eye on September 20th. I think you'll agree with me that close elections make for interesting panels, and we've been well served today. At Carleton, we've been holding events like the one you've just enjoyed today, a diplomatic and parliamentary orientation and programming for well over a decade. And over that time, and I hope that you've had the chance to see some of our other presentations. Hundreds of parliamentarians, diplomats, staffers have attended panels of this kind on all sorts of topics, including cybersecurity, the military, trade and diplomatic relationships, emergency preparedness, food, housing, water, etc. Today, I'm really pleased that we started a new partnership with the Parliamentary Center. I want to thank everybody involved in this very successful inaugural event. We're proud to work with the Parliamentary Center, especially since CEO Tom Cormier is also, you guessed it, a Carleton graduate. Great to work with you, Tom. This is what we call here at Carleton our capital advantage. We're in the national capital. We're always leveraging our closeness to the Hill, our closeness to the diplomatic community. Very briefly, since it's the first day of class here at Carleton, this is a great time for us. We have great momentum at over 31,000 students. We're larger than ever. We have our high-profile, innovative programs across all 5 of our faculties. And last year, in the middle of a worldwide pandemic, we graduated the largest class ever, well over 6,000 students moving on to successful and self-determined lives. This fall, we're opening the beautiful Nickel Building, new home for our Sprott School of Business, and we can't wait to invite everybody to visit this truly stunning facility. So this is a great time for Carleton. We have the size, the location, the talent, the mindset to really thrive in the next decade, and we'll come out of the pandemic stronger than ever. This event today highlights our capital advantage being in Ottawa, our links to the parliamentary and diplomatic communities. These are essential assets for us and for our continued success. So thanks again. Merci beaucoup d'avoir été avec nous aujourd'hui. Have a great day.
And I thank Carleton President Bacon. And again, really a very sincere thank you to our terrific sponsors. They are Air Canada, CN, IBC, Manulife, Nutrien, Suncor, TELUS, Toyota, and TD. And with that, we thank all of you for your participation and hope to see you again soon.
Yes.